In this episode, the featured film introduces us to the long-lost, forgotten world of silent cinema, that magical world of pantomime storytelling. Almost lost because, in reality, you can find many of the films from the silent era online if you look for them diligently, but not forgotten because in this episode we are going to shine as bright a light as we can on what I think is the best example of silent cinema, our featured film, and we will talk about the one true genius in all of motion picture history. These stories and more from the 22nd row. Before we begin, I would like to thank everyone who's been watching these podcasts or part of them. This episode marks my 5th week doing this, and I must say that the response has been beyond what I ever thought was possible. So I hope you keep watching. There's so many movies to talk about and so little time. City Lights was released in 1931 and is almost a silent film. So almost is the key word of this episode. It's almost a silent film. There is, of course, no talking, and therefore it is a silent film, but there is a soundtrack connected to the film. Now, not a musical score that in the theaters of the silent era, orchestras or 3 or 4 strings would play music to the picture, as I've talked about in previous episodes, but a soundtrack connected to the film, written by the power behind this film. And so that's why I think this film is an excellent introduction into this magical world of silent cinema. It's less of a bump than a purely silent movie might be. So the soundtrack was written by the man who wrote the film, starred in the film, directed the film, produced the film, hired the cast. He wasn't the photographer. And as I said, I believe is the one true genius in all of motion picture history. And his name is Charlie Chaplin. Now, Charlie Chaplin is British. He was born in London a long time ago, 1889 to be exact. His heyday, his popularity, worldwide popularity, was from about 1914 to 1931 when this film was released, or arguably 1936. So that's over 100 years ago when he began his movie-making career. So that's a bit of a jump. However, it is worthwhile to look at this film. Charlie Chaplin was born to music hall parents. Well, what's a music hall? At the turn of the century, music halls were very, very popular places of entertainment. There's no movies. There's of course, no radio. Might have been live bands in the park or something, but what did people do for entertainment? Adults, that is. They would go to these music halls. Think of a movie theater without the screen and with a stage. Maybe like a pub that has live bands or something like that, but with a much bigger stage. And so in these music halls, there would be singing, dancing, comedians, joke-telling, visual comedy, acrobats, magicians, a little bit of everything. And they also served alcohol. Now, Charlie Chaplin's father, Charlie Sr., was a popular performer in these music halls. Now, this wasn't a rich lifestyle. It wasn't a moneyed lifestyle. They were popular, they were known, but they didn't make a lot of money. So the Chaplin household was not moneyed by any stretch of the imagination. His mother worked with his father. He brought her in. She was less talented than he was, but he brought her onto the stage and she worked with him. Well, one of the key elements of music halls is they served alcohol. And as I understand it, these music halls would have performances every night, 7 days a week. And the performers would fraternize in the halls, and the danger was there was a lot of alcohol to be consumed. Now, not every music hall performer became an alcoholic, but Charlie Chaplin Sr. did. And he died very young, I think 37 or 38 years old, which left his Charlie Chaplin and his mother, who was, again, not a well-regarded performer, so the work got less and less, and so the household became very tight for money to the point where they were quite poverty-stricken. On top of that, at some point in her life, early life, she contracted syphilis. Now, at the turn of the century and for a few years into the 20th century, there was no cure for syphilis. And an advanced form of this disease would affect the brain. And in fact, by the time Charlie Chaplin was 14 years old, his mother went insane and was put into an insane asylum. Now, there's been some very famous people who had the same problem. Winston Churchill's father, Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister of England during the Second World War, and a very established figure, his father also died from syphilis. So at the turn of the century, this was a scary disease and an enormous problem. So Charlie Chaplin was on his own. He was a child of the streets, and London, unfortunately, was full of such people. Not all of them turned out to be Charlie Chaplin, but they were full of such kids. So what happened with Chaplin? Well, before this, of course, the parents would drag him into the music hall. He would be in the sidelines, and he would watch the shows day in and day out, night in and night out. So he had a lot of exposure to this world. And apparently, he liked it, and he wanted to be part of it when he got older. So by the time of 14, when he was scrambling to make a penny any way he could, sometimes in workhouses where they worked children to death and they slept overnight and they barely fed them. Sometimes he would just live in the street, live rough in the street, trying to make money. Eventually, he found a group of young people who were performing, like the music hall performers, and he was in a couple of groups, and they toured around, and he was reasonably successful. Of course, there wasn't much money at all to be had, but he was performing, and was well thought of at that time, even though very young. Well, around this time, his half-brother Sidney reappeared. Now, where he was, America or somewhere else in England, I'm not exactly sure. He was about 4 years older than Charlie, and he reappeared on the scene, took him under his wing, because Sidney was an accomplished music hall performer as well. And he was part of a troupe that would play in London and go to cities all around England. And he brought him in and said, no, my brother's here, and he's going to work with us, and and that's what happened. So, surprise, surprise, Charlie Chaplin, his star rose. He was, at first, looked on squeamishly. He was pale, he was thin, he was tiny, looked even younger than his years. But obviously he had talent, and he prospered and became part of this troupe, and they would travel around. And this troupe was reasonably successful to the point where there were promoters in America who asked them to come over and perform, go to various cities and perform in the US and then go back to England. Well, he went over twice. And the second time he went over, his boatmate, not Sidney, but shared a room, and then eventually when they were on tour, shared lodgings while they were on tour. It was a guy named Stan, I think it was Matthews, I think his name was, I may not have that right. But eventually this fellow named Stan would change his name to Stan Laurel, and he would be part of an extremely successful silent comedy duo with a fellow named Oliver Hardy, and they would be known as Laurel and Hardy, Stan Laurel and Oliver Hardy, and they would have a tremendous run in silent cinema as a duo comedians, and even had some talking pictures in which they did very well. So Stan and Charlie were friends in 1912, 1913. So they get over to America. They're pretty successful. They do their act that they did in London, they did in cities in England. They did the same thing night in, night out, night in, night out, and they were doing okay. To the point where Chaplin's star continued to rise, to the point where near the end of the tour, so scholars say and historians, he got premier billing for this comedy troupe, higher than his brother and higher than anybody else. Needless to say, that attracted the attention of some people in the movie business, and they approached Chaplin and said, why don't you do what you're doing on film? Now, this is 1913-ish. Movies were really starting to take off. Audiences were going nuts going to the theater. But the big draw was that they were going to offer Chaplin double what he was making with the troupe. Now, Chaplin, who had grown up in poverty and really knew destitution, jumped at the chance. He got offered the princely sum of $150, I think $175 a week to work for this company. Now, this company was known as Keystone, and the power behind this company, a very successful individual, was named Max Sennett. He happens to come from the sweet old country that I come from. And he was an incredibly successful promoter, producer, director of these films that he made, comedies, 6 minutes long, 12 minutes long, and this was normal for 1913, 1914, 1915, and maybe at the most 20, 25 minutes long. Fast-paced, frantic comedies, and he was the boss. So he hired Chaplin, and Chaplin had to do what he said. And of course, at the beginning, Chaplin did, because he was making more money than he had ever made before. And the product was comedy. Now, Keystone was very successful, but movie making in those days was a little bit funny. There weren't huge productions or anything. There were a few dramas that were made a few years later, made with big production budgets and all kinds of things, but the comedies were a cameraman, maybe a director, maybe somebody else, and a couple of actors, and they would work in makeshift studios, making a film a day, making 2 films a day, releasing it the next day or 2 days later. It was frantic in terms of production because the audience was craving more and more and more of these silent films. And then there were times when they would hear about an event going on in the city or the local near Los Angeles, near Hollywood, or any place close by. And they said, well, let's take 4 or 5 people out in a crew, go out to that thing and make a little story around what was happening. Maybe there was a fire, maybe there was some event. Well, in February of 1914, there was such an event. It was kids racing soapboxes. Now, what those were cars, little carts, like go-karts, but without engines. They would use gravity, set them up at the top of a steep area where there was a road or something they built, release them, and then they would, by gravity, go down the hill very fast along the streets, and there would be races. And the paper advertised such a race. I guess it was on a Saturday in February. Every day is warm and sunny in California, in Venice, California, which is close to Los Angeles. What kids and adults did in Saturday afternoons in Venice, California in 1913, I guess this was a big deal. So Senate sent out a couple of camera people and a director, and he told Chaplin to go out and perform in this 6-minute, 12-minute, 6-minute comedy. Now, prior to this, the comics that were in all these Max Sennett films, these Keystone films, of course, it was visual. They had to be funny, but not by telling jokes, not by having a funny voice, not by singing funny. It was all visual. So they always looked to add props to their bodies to look funny, whether it was big mustaches, lots of hair, no hair, big hats, small hats, anything to make them look funny. And Chaplin was no different. He was by now a veteran performer and knew what worked with audiences, and he was trying to come up with the same thing. He didn't want to play lots of different roles. He thought he could, what if he made a character that just kind of worked? And this has been documented a million times over in autobiography, his autobiography, in biographies, and all kinds of historians have talked about this, Chaplin himself. But he basically thought that, he stated that comedians like contrast. You know, if you have 2 comedians, one's really tall, one's really short, one's heavy, one's skinny, things like that. So if he's going to make a character, he's got to have contrast. So he's going to have big baggy pants, then he's got to have a really tight jacket. He's going to have a little hat, not a big hat. He's not going to have big shoes, he's going to have really big shoes. And he's going to have a walking stick, not a firm walking stick, but a bendable walking stick. And then the last touch is, because he still looks so young and he needed to look old, he needed to look like an adult, he thought, well, I'll add a mustache, but not a big mustache, because that would block some of the expressions he wanted to use to convey the story through his face. So he painted on a very small mustache just below his nose and on his lip, you know, very small. And the clothes they were very tattered, there were holes in the pants, and the shoes were worn, and he looked like what he called a tramp. But he had the airs of a gentleman. So this was, again, another contradiction. Don't act like a tramp, act like a gentleman. That makes it funnier, as opposed to just being a down-and-out person who acts like a down-and-out person and whatever. He acted like he was actually a very sophisticated, successful person. So he decided to take this character into film. Now, he had made a film prior to this Venice race, but that hadn't been released yet. So he didn't know he liked the character, he thought it would work. So when he went to this place in Venice for this race, he went as the Tramp. Now, what's interesting about this is that here's this filmmaking where they just go out and they're going to tell a little story, but they're going to use a real backdrop. There were no, the people on the streets watching these races, they weren't studio people, they weren't hired, they were just people from Venice watching these races. And they just thought that these camera people were photographing the race, and that's exactly what they were supposed to think. The camera people were going to photograph this soapbox race. I guess they were really popular. So the story trick is that Chaplin, as this tramp, sees the camera and he wants to get in front of the camera. He thinks, oh, that's be really cool. I'm going to get in front of the camera and I'm going to act like I'm a movie star. And the joke is that the director gets mad and he pushes him out of the shot, and 2 seconds later Chaplin re-enters the shot again and doing things. So that's how it goes on. And in fact, this film called Kid Auto Races at Venice is also known as The Pest, because Chaplin, the character, the tramp, wouldn't leave the film. But I've watched this film, and it's exactly 6 minutes and 30 seconds, give or take a few seconds long. That's it. And you look at the people lining the street. Now, there weren't 100 people and there weren't 10,000, but there were a lot of people there. You know, what do you do in Venice on a Saturday afternoon? There were a lot of people there, and very quickly they start watching this interaction between the tramp and the camera more than they were watching the soapbox that's coming down the hill and going at pretty fast speeds. And of course, this was all made up by Chaplin and the director, so the director would come out and push Chaplin down and he'd fall on his back and do a little tumble, but he'd get up right away, so the audience wasn't scared by this, it just looked funny. And he did this again and again a few times and kept coming back into the camera. So this is, and these real people, ordinary people, were watching this, and you can see them smiling, see them laughing, and they were really enjoying it. Pause. Now, I am a big, big fan, as I've mentioned many times, of beginnings, of when things happen that didn't happen before, from nothing to something. The writer's blank page, the painter's blank canvas, the sculptor's big block of stone before they, make Macbeth, or Rembrandt, or Michelangelo's David. It's just nothing and then something. So this film, this live performance, was the very first time this character known as the Tramp appeared on this planet. Now, the other film that he made earlier was released after this one, so they argue that this was the first time, but it was certainly in public. So this performance, all these people lining the street who saw this, of course, had no way of knowing that they were watching history, because the film business within months would change completely, because this tramp character was so beloved, it became known throughout the world, and all you needed to do was draw a little silhouette of a derby hat, maybe from a face suit, a mustache, and a cane and baggy pants, and everybody knew who that was. And in fact, this 6-minute film made in February of 1914 has now been put into the National Registry of Film in the U.S. by the Library of Congress, because it is the first iteration of Charlie Chaplin as the Tramp. So, which I just think is fabulous. What would it have been like to have been standing there watching these go-karts go by and see this funny-looking little guy doing his thing and thinking it was clever and funny and laughing at it and not realizing that they were part of history. But they were. So Chaplin continues to work for Keystone, but the Keystone comedies were not the same as what Chaplin wanted to do. Keystone, as I said, were fast, frantic, crazy, lots of people falling down what's called slapstick, people falling down but not getting hurt. People getting punched and banged on the head but getting right back up again. It was violent but not nasty violent. It was supposed to be funny violent. Chaplin did all that, but he wanted to do something different. And eventually another group came along and said, your films are really popular, people really like you, why don't you come work for us? And this was the Mutual Fund Company. And so Chaplin had been making, he probably had increased his income, but he started out making $175 a week. When he joined the Mutual Fund Film Company, about a year, 2 years later, let's say 18 months, I'm not exactly sure, he was paid $10,000 a week. Because by this point, by 1915, 1916, he was the most famous actor in the world. And as I mentioned in an earlier episode, silent films were everywhere. They were all over the world because, of course, there was no talking, which meant there was no language barrier. Any country in the world could play a silent film, and audiences would either like it or not like it, whatever, but they were everywhere. And Chaplin was the first and biggest star, and he remained the biggest star for the next 15 years of silent film. There were many other stars, many wonderful actors and actresses who became huge stars and did really fun films, but Chaplin was the biggest. So he had this 18-month contract to produce 12 films for the Mutual Fund Company. And if you look at the documentaries and read anything about Chaplin, he has said many times that this was his happiest time because it was the first time he had control over what he did. He would write the stories, he would star in them, he would hire everybody. It was the beginnings of when he had complete control over what he made. And he was making, again, 6, 12, maybe 25-minute films, and they were very, very successful. But of course, for Chaplin, it wasn't enough. When that contract expired, another company came along and they said, we want you to now do your thing with us. And Chaplin then said, okay, I want $1 million. And even though they balked at first, they paid him $1 million to, I think there was no time restriction, and I don't know how many films, but it might have been 10 or 12 films or something he had to make. I don't remember exactly, but he was being paid in those days a fortune. In fact, it was estimated that he was one of the richest people on the planet based upon that income. Now, not owning oil, well, there were oil wells then, or shipping lines or railroads, but he was one of the richest people on the planet. And what happened was he made sure that he could do anything he wanted. He could take as much time as he wanted, and he would have 100% control of literally everything. And they said, sure, because the company before them, Mutual, had made all their money back and then some from Chaplin films, and they knew that they would make their money back, and they did. So after a few short films again, that were very successful, that fire of genius inside him had to come out, and so he decided to do more. He wanted more depth to his stories. He wanted more than just comedy. He wanted to have romance and sadness and tears and laughter, and he wanted longer films. So he eventually made his first feature film. Now, it's not 3 hours long. There were some films that were made that were 3 hours long in those days, but they were dramas, and this was a comedy. And comedies were, I think it's safe to say, were much more popular than dramas. The audiences in the tweens and in the big years of silent cinema, they loved comedies. They loved everything about them. And there were many, many big stars. None as big as Chaplin. Some of them almost as big as Chaplin, but there were many big stars. So Chaplin makes a feature film. And his first film, as again, if you ever look at these things, had a lot to do with his childhood. He played the Tramp. Now, every movie he ever made between 1914 and 1936, he only played one character, and that was this Tramp character. He wanted to use this character as the vehicle to tell whatever story he wanted to tell. So he makes a story of this tramp on the streets, of course, and he meets a kid, an orphan on the streets, and they form a relationship and they become a partnership. And the film is called The Kid. 85 minutes long. It was sad. It was funny. It had everything the Chaplin films had before that and more. And to no one's surprise, it was a spectacular success. And that meant that Chaplin was going to make feature films of length from then on. The next film he made was a few years later. It's called The Gold Rush, and again was incredibly successful. And there is a couple of scenes in that film that are repeated again and again and again because they're very iconic and they're fun to look at. And if you ever see the film, or if you've never seen a silent film, you might have seen outtakes from this film with these very fun scenes. And it's pretty cool. But it was very successful and did nothing but whet Chaplin's appetite to do more and more. But he took his time. He really took his time. He was the man in these movies. He did whatever he wanted. He did it but most importantly, he did it when he wanted. And he was a perfectionist. And if it wasn't just right, he would keep shooting and shooting and shooting until he got it right. Now, I'm going to suggest here, I really hope that if you do want to check out silent cinema and check out Chaplin, that you watch City Lights. But there is nothing short of a spectacular documentary called Unknown Chaplin. It's kind of hard to find. And one of the episodes has been severely edited, probably for copyright reasons. They took out all the real cool stuff about City Lights. But episode 1 is narrated by an actor named James Mason, who did a lot of narration because he's got this perfect voice. it's just spectacular, talking about what a perfectionist Chaplin was, how much time he took to shoot his films, how he did everything on film. And he could afford to do it because, of course, he was so wealthy. He shot everything on film until he got what he wanted, and it's just really a tremendous insight into this genius. Anyhow, by 1929, he's ready to do another film, and that film is going to be City Lights. And he plays the tramp. It's a very simple story, as he has in the title card of the movie. It's a comedy romance in pantomime. But again, because it was going to be released, by the time he was finished, it was going to be released at the time of the talkies, he thought it would be a failure, or he was very worried that it would be a failure. Audiences were in the middle of the fad of talking pictures. Silent films had fallen off a cliff. No one was making silent films anymore by 1930, 1931. They were talkies. And although many of the films were bad films, because Hollywood, as I've mentioned, hadn't figured out how to make better films with talking pictures. They had to relearn how to make movies after silence. They were getting better, and the Hollywood talent was learning how to make better movies. So Chaplin, he couldn't let the Tramp speak. The Tramp had been so successful in silent films, he thought it would just destroy not only his legacy, but also if people went back and saw those movies, they just wouldn't look at them the same way if they had seen a movie where the Tramp spoke. So because he was so powerful, and because he answered to no one, more or less, assuming his films were successful, he decided to make it silent, but with the soundtrack. And he did. Now, to no one's surprise, it was spectacularly successful, and decade after decade after decade, film historians, film buffs, film fans have said it's the greatest movie ever made. That's fine, be that as it may. As I said, I don't want to categorize films or art in any way like that. But it was very, very successful, and Chaplin breathed a sigh of relief. And it was really, he would make one more silent film with the Tramp. 5 years later it was released, and there would not be any more Chaplin films, silent films featuring this Tramp. But I think City Lights was at the height of his powers and a great story. So, here's a problem. Now, there are dramas and comedies. You could take, even though there are many genres, you could split them into two categories, dramas and comedies. And I've always thought that people are just more comfortable with dramas. You know, people cry, people scream, they yell, they get mad. There's action film, there's violence film. Everybody can relate to anger and sadness and all those things, hate. Comedies are different. Have you ever been in a situation, say, hey, you should watch this film, it's really funny, and they always say, that wasn't funny at all. There's something about a sense of humor that I think is a little more elusive than our ability to appreciate drama. You know, you might think, yeah, the movie wasn't very good, or I didn't think it was that great, but, you know, I could follow along. But people have really, really strong opinions about comedies. That movie wasn't funny at all. Why did you think that was funny? So silent cinema survived with comedies because it was all visual, and they were so clever on how they fell down and got up and hit each other and fell off buildings and jumped between trains, all kinds of things. If you ever watch these silent films, you'd be amazed at how clever these comics actually were. And Chaplin, of course, was at the top of that mountain. So the first time I saw City Lights, I was in film school. I was in my cinema studies class, and there'd been a lot of hype about it. I don't know if I'd seen a silent movie before that. I might have, but I certainly had not seen Chaplin, and I had not seen City Lights before. So about 10 or 15 of us in this class, and we watched this film, and then afterwards, the next day in our class, everybody talked about what brilliant it was and what a classic and how fabulous this comedy was, but nobody laughed. Throughout the film, nobody laughed, and neither did I. And I thought about that and said, well, why didn't I laugh? This is kind of a funny film, clever as hell. And the thing was, it was so clever, you went into a trance. You were just in awe from scene to scene of how clever this little tramp was, this fellow Chaplin, what he could do to make people laugh, how he could evoke emotions, how he could be sad and funny within seconds, the poetry of his movements. You were just stunned. So the next time I saw it, I did laugh because there's some genuinely, I think, funny moments in this film. And I really came to appreciate how funny the film is, how serious it is, how sad it is. And so it's often been called a tragic comedy, which is a combination of both, because it is a romance, and it is funny, and there's a lot going on in this film. As I say, it's Chaplin at its peak, and it is, I find it just incredible. But I will say this, as I've said, I hope to say in every episode for every film, 95% of what you like or don't like about a film, you should get from the screen, what you see on that screen. Now, it's nice to know a bit of context if you want. It's nice to know a little bit about, you know, if it's a musical in 1930s Berlin, well, what was going on then? Why are these things so prominent in the story? It's nice to know a little bit without talking about the story itself. And that's why I don't do, of course, I don't do spoilers. And I do say there's some brilliant scenes in this film, but you got to watch them to appreciate them. But I don't want to go beyond that. It's all about what's up on the screen. Now, there are places that you can look up on the internet that are chock full of context and anecdotes and information about movies. This actor hated this actress. This guy was a real mean guy in this film because he had hemorrhoids throughout the course of the shoot and all stuff that, in its place, it can be amusing stuff and it can be fun to know that. But really, if you're learning about films for the first time and if you're seeing a silent movie for the first time, the best way to do that is to know a little bit about it. And I've obviously spent a little bit of time talking about Chaplin, who I say is a unique person in all of movie making. But really, you should watch the film and take from it what you want from your first viewing off, you know, whatever big screen you can have access to. So that being said, the film is an incredible testament to silent cinema. And although silent films may not be for everybody, and you may kind of go, I think this film is definitely worthy of representing the silent period, again, made by its greatest, the greatest participant in these films. And so the problem, again, is that you can go on the internet and you can see snippets of this film, and it's fine. I mean, why not? But if you see certain scenes that I think are unbelievably good and unbelievably moving, you don't see them in the context of what happened before that scene or after, or you don't have the flow of the story. So I think the best scenes in this film, and there are many poetic, wonderful scenes, and there's one scene that I will not tell you when it occurs, but it works in and of itself, but it works if you watch the movie from beginning to end. And I think I've said before that I'm a sucker for movies. I'm a movie fan. I love films. I can get into them big time. I can laugh as hard as anyone. I can cry as much as anyone. I can be moved by tragedy and angered by injustices and things. But so this scene, for me, is the most moving scene of any film I've ever seen. And I've seen, obviously, a lot of films, less than others and more than some, but I've never seen a scene, as I saw in City Lights, that moved me the way this one did. It's so incredibly poetic. It's photographed so perfectly. It comes at a point in the story that is absolutely fits perfectly in everything that's gone on. And I defy anyone who has a pulse to not like this moment. And I'm a big fan of moments. And even though I have my favorite films, I also have films I like, but have spectacular moments. And I have films that I don't like a whole lot, but also have spectacular moments. But this film has everything. At least, that's how I see City Lights from the 22nd row.